The air hung heavy over the brownstone blocks where the warm lights of Fairmont Crest no longer promised safety and instead sharpened the edges of every shadow pooling on the stoop, the back gardens, and the tree-lined streets. Everything seemed to hold its breath and wait for a decisive signal. Kat and Jacob stepped into a new spiral of the search the moment instinct and scant facts began to click in unnerving ways. A key forgotten in the glove box of a rental car, a locksmith receipt dated one day off from when Chelsea disappeared, a smeared clip from a flower shop camera at the corner showing a woman in a long coat boarding a plumber's service van with its plate bent just enough to confuse an automatic reader. Jacob rebuilt the sequence on a timeline, flagging gaps and marking irregularities. Kat retraced calls and cross-checked addresses tied to a cluster of micro-logistics outfits that ferried supplies in and out of basement retrofits. A fresh thread appeared like a hairline stitch. A building permit packet for a house with an old wine cellar left vacant for years, owned by an LLC registered in a distant state, the legal representative signing under a name that pricked the skin because it had once drifted close to a person Kat never wished to remember. The instant she realized that thread tugged toward Joey, she understood each ring dialed and each step taken might redraw the danger map and pull the people she loved onto a chessboard with no safe squares. Urgency to see Chelsea alive still won out. Kat chose to act, to coax Joey into the open, to gamble once on the belief that speed paired with care could still save them, even as the feeling of an unseen trap settled in the dark like mist across the brownstone. Martin refused to mute the low burn that rose when he recognized Chelsea as only one of countless disappearances tallied into statistics. In closed-door sessions and quiet drafts, he began sketching a proposal for an emergency response system, budget reallocation, and interagency. Protocols that would lift cases involving missing women and children of color into an unambiguous priority with clockwork measured in hours, not weeks. Smitty alone saw the awkward intersection of civic faith and political realism. To move a bill, Martin would have to bargain with blocks, absorb media fusillades, and possibly spend down his own capital. Smitty hugged him the way brothers do, not to soothe with words but to anchor him to the first reasons. The why that had started all of this, the why that would not allow another family to lose someone in silence. That was when Kat's message about the hazardous proposition arrived. Meet Joey. Martin instantly read the risk of a gray zone exchange between law and shadow. On one hand, a potential shortcut to Chelsea, on the other a perfect snare to recast a legislator as a bribe taker or an interloper in an investigation, especially with someone like Joey who understood how slowly systems move and how easily a clipped video can steer a crowd. Martin still agreed, not out of naivete but because the only way to keep control was to drag light into the room. Smitty took the site, swept for jammers, set standoff distances and escape routes, and left a breadcrumb trail visible enough for law enforcement to notice without storming in. Every piece was strung tight, where a single step too much or too little could snap the line. The meat unfolded at a decommissioned riverside warehouse once used to stage imports, train horns masking small noises and sodium lamps jaundicing the scene so that roadside cameras caught only silhouettes. Joey arrived on time without obvious tails, suspicion seeping from the way he tossed his phone into his pocket in airplane mode and stood inside earshot yet 3 paces back, as though he had mapped the circumference of a recorder's pickup. His offer was nothing short of an ultimatum. Help the family find Chelsea in exchange for Martin clearing a debt, sweetened by a data pack on Allison, gathered only by someone woven into the underground threads. Martin neither nodded nor declined. He let the tempo settle into a patience so steady it bordered on irritating, stretching minutes into cover while Smitty finished scattering fingerprint, less eyes sealed by one-time keys in case someone later tried to rewrite the story. When it ended, Martin held an encrypted file on Allison, hair-fine financial routes braiding into a durable plate of shell companies, a consultancy contract misaligned with demonstrated skills, and, most tellingly, entries and exits at sites labeled charitable. He passed a clean duplicate to Kat and Jacob and isolated the original in a cold store Smitty had readied, refusing to let a single poisoned bite bleed into their core systems. Kat read like swallowing flame. Every annotation screamed that Allison was neither a simple accomplice nor a puppet. Timestamps placed her at a small-room fundraiser among only direct acquaintances, then at a basement retrofit permit office, then at a church running a re-entry program. The pattern forced a larger question. Was Allison a mask for an abduction model that also operated safe houses, or a person pressed between plates by someone who owned her weaknesses? Kat had once misread Joey and Allison through the lens of gossip and happenstance glimpses. The dataset now opened a deeper plane where a few harmless-seeming messages might be distress signals encoded by a stray capital letter. Jacob peeled each layer with care, reconciling co-located time blocks, building a heat map of Allison's presence near cold storage, container yards, or moisture-proofed work sites. The result converged on a mixed commercial residential strip where the plumber's van had been seen, less than 10 minutes from the house with the old cellar. They knew they had to move, yet knew as surely that any rush could trigger a relocation or another vanishing. Patience became the hardest discipline when time ticked inside a ribcage. Meanwhile, the legal price of Kat's outreach to Joey hovered like a storm shelf at the horizon. If Joey proved to be a link in the chain, her unsealing a channel to Martin could be spun as abetting, however unintended. The risk sharpened where adversaries knew how to weaponize feeds. A freeze frame of Kat and Joey in the same frame with a coy caption, and a gale of suspicion would do the rest. Kat recognized the border between seeker and line crosser as hair-thin, especially if fallout cut into Martin, her parents, and a family already strained by the empty space where Chelsea should be. She forced herself to imagine standing in the open if everything went wrong, to take responsibility for trusting instinct over warning lights, even if that instinct was pulling them nearer to the place where Chelsea might be held. The tug-of-war turned into discipline. She refused to cut corners again, synchronized with Jacob in micro-moves, layered with Smitty so high-tech advances sat inside physical cover, and fed Martin only what he needed to hold a public-private balance strong enough to parry the dirtiest narrative if the time came. Then the past pushed through a seam when a company name brushed a memory Martin had sutured shut. Years ago that name had appeared, faint and fleeting, in a file about a rainy night crash where his brother died under circumstances never fully unknotted. The case had closed swiftly on hydroplaning with no evidence of design. Now odd payments from that same company led toward an anonymous account disbursing security consulting fees to a cadre of logistics hands. Martin did not say it aloud, but Smitty caught the stiffening in his shoulders and understood that a taut thread had been yanked between now and a wound. If Joey sensed it, he could lay his snare, forcing Martin to choose between justice for Chelsea and a truth about his brother that might calcify in the wrong shape. On Martin's desk, the draft bill shifted tone. Beyond resources and process, it added a mechanism to independently re-examine closed files when linked to shell operations or underground retrofits. A polite way to say the system must learn to look into its own mirror when confronted with persistent unknowns. Joey refused stillness. He sprayed decoys. Anonymous texts claiming a Chelsea sighting in an exurban mall. An email to a crime columnist hinting that Martin had sunk into an unholy deal. Each could be swatted upon inspection, but each tugged attention off course. Kat and Jacob unwound the braids, riding in parallel on cell tower crumbs, public camera grids, and routine maps of the places Chelsea frequented. They concluded that every decoy sat outside the plausible footprint of a keeper intent on quiet, reinforcing the first hunch. Chelsea likely hovered near the basement retrofits by the container yard. For the last stitch, Jacob leveraged a hidden quirk in the district's new gas leak sensors. Every abrupt valve open shut in a basement registered a microspike at the contractor's console. 3 spikes across 2 nights matched the hours decoys were launched, proof of someone moving below ground to receive goods or move a person. Kat's breath shaved short, and she forced it long as she and Jacob shaped a silent insertion timed against first light deliveries, slipping through camera-blind corners under the blanket roar of compressors. Inside the family, Vanessa and Danny held a membrane between fear and routine, keeping visits and charitable work humming so the absence did not become a sinkhole that swallowed everyone whole. Anita quietly convened counsel, gaming out every legal angle if Kat was dragged into an aiding-by-accident charge, assembling arguments about intent to save life, about coordination with licensed security and officials, about technological measures used specifically to prevent harm. The armor weighed more on Kat's shoulders but transmuted fear into method. She denied herself the ease of snap judgments, refused bias over evidence, refused emotion over data. In silence, she wrote a short note not as a farewell but as a vow to step forward if the arc bent the wrong way, a promise to stand before anyone else in her family had to. Then sealed it in an encrypted folder Jacob could open only if needed, ritual as focused. At gray dawn the plan lit. A subcontractor van rolled in under the smell of paint and damp wood. Machines droning. At the fence seam, Kat and Jacob slid through a hand-width gap, crept along sweating brick, and slipped between two trembling old cameras. The new steel door wore a thin chalk of plaster dust. Jacob set the silent opener while Kat hovered over a kill switch. Inside smelled of wet lumber, pipework scissoring the ceiling over temporary bracing. A handheld thermistor tagged an odd hot spot behind a false wall. They traced rewrapped wire to a swapped gas sensor wired as a silent alarm feeding a small transmitter. Each time the cache opened, a ping vaulted into the mobile net and hopped 2 or 3 relays before landing on a ghost phone. Kat stopped Jacob from prying, pulled the transmitter's plug, shunted it through a dummy resistor to keep the line level steady, and eased the panel. The space was empty save for a folding chair, a thin blanket, a tote with bottles, bandages, and analgesics. Hearts dipped once. It was the kind of temporary cell stripped hours earlier. In the corner, though, dust scuffed into a short mark like a sign. Kat shot it and recognized the shorthand Chelsea used in a community project notebook years ago. A compressed place code fused to a directional number. Chelsea had been there and had tried to say she was being moved on a fixed rotation, possibly to circle back if a trap worked. The letdown could have sunk them, but instead clicked them into phase 2. If the cell was a relay, the main hold would sit inside the delivery window on the contractor's routing chart Jacob had just pulled, narrowed to 3 candidates, one a small leased cold room under a private name tied to odd expenses Allison had co-signed. The truth dragged Allison deeper into gray. Was she participating by choice or acting under duress? Her movement profile showed long silences punctured by sudden appearances at critical points, consistent with someone yanked by strings. Kat set feeling aside. This was no time for an easy love or loathe that could ruin the only chance to haul Chelsea into daylight. Martin ran a parallel play in public. He disclosed a scoping calendar for the bill and invited grassroots advocates, women's organizations, and frontline social workers to mark it up, drawing the narrative away from Joey's trap. When the crowd looks at the system, personalization loses bite. He also routed raw data to an independent analysis group outside direct enforcement, a technical buffer to authenticate context if anyone recast the meeting as a crooked deal. Smitty kept sifting for booby-trapped code in isolation, letting nothing toxic touch the mains. Both men understood how small errors metastasize. The next night, the cold room on the Riverside line turned focal. A small box truck nosed in at dusk and left too fast for standard intake. Jacob intercepted gate calls, identified a key card born 3 weeks prior. Serials traced back to a logistics firm with Allison as the receiving signatory. A mushy camera frame, clarified with denoise, revealed a hatted female figure near the door. Kat and Jacob waited for one more proof. Near midnight, the temperature log burped at Bay 3 as the truck belly opened. At that instant, a familiar ping string leapt from the same ghost band that had received the basement alarm. Conditions were met to enter, except for the last riddle, whether a touch trap sat ready to explode into a media event, flipping rescue into sabotage. Kat bought 10 more minutes for Smitty to settle broad radius cover so no one would be pinned if the board shattered. The cold bit like iron. Totes stacked in rows left an aisle just wide enough for 2. In the far corner, tarp lashed over a rig of PVC and straps. They pulled it and found no one, only restraints, fresh traces of habitation, and a paper fleck tucked beneath a plastic rib. The same shorthand recurred. The trailing number ticked from 2 to 1. A countdown. Kat understood Chelsea was breadcrumbing in a code only the inner ring would catch. The clock had nearly run. A new detail cut through despair. A medical strip wrapper marked for soft tissue injury relief, peeled within 24 hours. That meant Chelsea was alive, kept quiet enough to move, watched by someone with basic clinical sense. The mosaic slid away from crude brutality to a network that wore legal masks, sustained bare minimum conditions to avoid a death that would draw heat, yet kept the hostage at the lip of peril. That moment Kat faced the worst case cleanly. If something touched Martin now, a staged accident, a turnkey from his brother's file sprung at the wrong angle, would she be the one who had risked the family for a case that might still fail? The question did not slow her. It carved a bright line. Every choice henceforth would put safety before provocation, evidence before intuition, coordination before solo bravado. She breathed, signaled Jacob to sweep their traces, bag only what Smitty needed along the safe channel, and ghosted back out. The plan rolled into a vice. Let the opposition believe their bait still drew while law and tech tightened slow and sure. Let the last handoff expose its route. Turn each ping from those minimal alarms into a hinge they would lock at the exact second. Daylight bled into a full slate as Martin announced the community sessions, pulling him from corners where personal questions might trap him. He stood with mothers holding placards of their daughters, with organizers who kept spiral notebooks of who to call, where to send, what to do inside the first 48 hours. The sight diluted rumors about Joey, shrinking them to debris in a wider mural. The counterpunch came, another email to the reporter, this time with a cut of an industrial park frame, hoping to stick Martin to darkness. The independent team time-stamped and geolocated it, showing the crop and killing the blow. Martin did not win with one response but with a chain of tight moves that forced the other side off cadence. The slip finally came not in a headline but in an automated toll charge stamped to a small truck sliding through a late slot under a registration tethered to a shell shared by Joey and Allison. The last night dropped like a thick curtain. Smitty planted watchers, exits, and a civilian ambulance in disguise at the perimeter. Jacob opened raw radio ears. Kat stood in the dark and pushed all stray thought aside. The signals arrived, basement ping, then cold room ping skipping 2 relays, then a thin chirp at the container stack by the water. Under 12 minutes, all lines converged. The ground trembled as the truck backed in. Doors clanked, feet moved fast, metal kissed metal, and then silence. The vice closed. Cover teams braided footsteps to seal every exit. Jacob froze the gate controls. Smitty flooded the band with white to cut out calls. Kat moved in, slid behind a guard, locked an arm in a heartbeat. Inside the box, a figure curled under a blanket with ragged but definite breathing. Chelsea lived. It did not end there because noise at a second container drew them out. But arms were already lifting Chelsea free, feeding her into the safe arms of the disguised ambulance, snapping zip ties and rolling into motion. The second container was a hollow theater with a hidden camera, a decoy to harvest footage for a future smear. Smitty's wall of interference turned the film to snow. As the van's lights thinned behind them and the industrial grid receded, as distant horns dissolved into exhaustion, the oldest questions returned. Kat knew rescue was only the starting rung on a taller ladder. Who ran the network, where Allison truly stood on the spectrum from victim to agent, what Joey planned once the highest value leverage was gone, and whether the shadow of Martin's brother would be bait for the next swing. For the first time in days, she allowed a period to land. The promise she had written changed shape. It was no longer an oath to absorb blame for a mistake, but a pledge to keep moving until the system no longer forced people like her to cut through gray to save one. In the corridors of government and the glare of the press, Martin stood upright at a panel to talk not merely about a bill but about a way to protect dignity. In Kat's eyes, he saw fear beaten back by discipline. In Chelsea's, he saw a dim, tired flame that still refused to go out. In Smitty's, he caught an unspoken nod. Down where unnameable things live, he felt the real fight beginning. Trace the shells, damn the capital that snakes as if it were steel yet slips through seams, reopen files long shut by haste, unwind Allison's masks to separate the person from the web, and, above all, build a legal frame that starves this game of air. Whether Kat had fully grasped Joey's danger no longer mattered at the personal scale. What remained was how they, as one body, would turn fear into policy, instinct into procedure, and a single rescue into a barrier against the next. In Fairmont Crest, the porch lights came on out of habit and the roads sank under trees again. But in the dark, a new map slid into a drawer, ready to open the next time evil tried to find its way back.